In our last video, we were working with point objects. In this video, I want to show you that we can do a lot more than points if we choose. So let's make an object called a porcupine. So that means in a file called porcupine.java, I'm going to define what it means to be a porcupine. What does it mean to be a porcupine? Well, a porcupine is going to be a bundle of data, just like a point was a bundle of data. But a porcupine is going to be a bundle of how many quills it has, which I'll call num quills, so that's a field, remember, and a Boolean value, which tells me whether or not the porcupine is angry, which is, of course, very important, especially the more quills the porcupine has, the more I might care about whether it's angry and going to shoot off quills at me. So this is the entire contents of a file called porcupine.java, and once I have this file handy, I've introduced a new data type in Java called porcupine. Maybe not one that you would use particularly often, but whatever. Okay, so, and just to review a little bit more, we'll define a method somewhere that creates a porcupine called createPorcupine. Its return value is of type porcupine. And when I create a porcupine, I'm going to give it a value n. And n is going to be the number of quills to create that porcupine with. So let's see, we'll define a variable p of type porcupine. And remember, at this point, I haven't created any porcupines. But then when I say new porcupine, I have indeed created a porcupine, and I'm going to store that in my variable p, because that's what p can store. And we're going to create a number, we're initialize p's number of quills to be n. Right, that was the point of n. And we'll initialize is angry to be true, because porcupines, we'll say that porcupines are born angry. Right, as soon as this porcupine is created, it is furious. Right, it's just been pushed out through its mother's womb. It's crying. It's upset. It's angry, which is bad because it's got all those quills. And at the end, we'll return that porcupine. So now we've got a method that makes porcupines, and let's work through a lovely little example of using a porcupine. So here we go. Example of using a porcupine. Porcupine. What's a good name for a porcupine? How about Quilly? Quilly sounds like a porcupine. Quilly refers to a brand new. Actually, Quilly is going to be the result of creating a porcupine with 10,000 quills. So we'll call this method. It will create my porcupine for me. It'll return that porcupine, and we'll store it in the variable Quilly. And then we'll make another porcupine. And another good name for porcupine might be, let's say, Frank. And I'm going to write something interesting here. I'm going to say Frank. Now, Frank is a variable that can get the value of any porcupine object, right? So we could make a new porcupine. We can use my createPorcupine method, which inside of it creates a new porcupine and returns that. But we can store any porcupine, right? So why not store Quilly himself, right? And I want to see what that does. So in particular, I want to know what is the value of Frank equals Quilly. Will that be true or false? And let's continue with these thoughts. Suppose I now write Quilly.isAngry equals false. So Quilly is no longer angry. And I want to know what is the value of Frank is angry after I do that. And maybe even what was the value before. So I want to walk through and see in painstaking detail, because I love that kind of pain. I want to see, what did this code really do? So let's begin. Well, the first thing it did was it created a variable called Quilly. There's our variable. And it then created a porcupine with 10,000. Now technically what it did was it made a porcupine object. So we'll make a porcupine object. You think that looks like a porcupine? Sure. I think actually I'm going to represent these as well. All right, fine. You've convinced me. We'll see if Dave can draw a porcupine. So let's see. A porcupine might look something like like that, right? Don't worry, this is going somewhere. That's the eye, this is his nose, and these are his quills. That kind of looks a little like a porcupine or a shoe or something. Go with it. Alright, so there's my porcupine, and that gets associated with Quilly. And when that porcupine gets created, it initializes its number of quills to be n, and whether it's angry to be true. N was 10,000. So let's make a note of those things. And this is precisely why I didn't want to draw this picture, because now I actually want to store that stuff. So let's go ahead. It's got a number of quills, which is apparently 10,000, and it's got a field called isAngry, which is apparently true, right? True. We said it's true when we called create porcupine. So we created this thing. So okay, now I've got a really deformed porcupine shoe thing. Okay, what do I do next? The next line of code said, so Quilly got the value of that porcupine, and that's where this blue arrow came from. Now, Frank is another variable, so Frank is a variable here, and Frank gets the value of Quilly. So you may think to yourself, oh, Frank gets the value of Quilly. Quilly's values are 10,000 and true, so we're going to get a porcupine whose num quills is 10,000 and whose isAngry is true, and you're going to draw this arrow just like you did before, right, Dave? Wrong. I only draw one of these blobs when I encounter the words new porcupine, which I did because I called create porcupine, which then says new porcupine. That's the only time I create an object. I didn't encounter those words with Frank, right? What we said was Frank gets the value of Quilly. That doesn't say new porcupine. It says Frank gets the value of Quilly. What is the value of Quilly? The value of the variable Quilly is a memory address. It's the memory address where this porcupine thing is stored in memory, right? So maybe that's stored at memory address, let's see, memory address, here, so I don't have to write so much, 37,856. In which case, what's really in Quilly is the memory address 37,856, but I represent that pictorially by just drawing an arrow from Quilly to this place in memory, because I don't really care what the memory address actually is. I just care that Quilly refers to whatever object is at that memory address. But in the same sense, when I say Frank gets the value of Quilly is really that memory address, so Frank gets that same memory address. And if Frank has the same memory address, then really that means, let's get rid of memory addresses since we don't really care what the memory address is, that means Frank refers to the same object. So if Frank has the same memory address, then Frank refers to the same object. So there's only one porcupine. It just happens to have two names. Sometimes this is called the aliasing problem, right? Quilly has an alias of Frank. Both Frank and Quilly are names for the same porcupine object. They're aliases. And so now I think the rest of this behavior is going to be, the rest of this problem will be pretty easy. Frank equals Quilly? Well, if we were to say Quilly equals create porcupine 10,000, that would be false. Quilly refers to this porcupine with 10,000 and true. Create porcupine would make a new porcupine with 10,000 and true. And since they're two different porcupine objects, they live in different places in memory, they're not equal. On the other hand, we didn't say that. We said Frank equals Quilly. Well, Frank and Quilly both have the same memory address, right? They both refer to the same object, so that is going to be true. Now, Quilly.isAngry gets the value of false. What do? We say Quilly, here's Quilly. Quilly isAngry is over here. That should get the value false, and I think you can see now what that did. We just changed both Frank and Quilly. Both Quilly isAngry will be false, but Frank isAngry will also be false. And why is that? Because Quilly and Frank are names for just one porcupine. We didn't change two porcupines with one line of code here. We changed one porcupine that has two names. Okay. I think that's a good place to stop for a moment. But we're going to work through some more examples where we have scary diagrams of me trying to draw porcupines and see what kind of crazy things happen when we start passing them to methods and start working with objects, methods that take in objects and manipulate those objects. So we'll see you in the next video.